in the prisons, you basically meet like a parallel Syrian society, right? So all the poets and intellectuals and academics and everybody's there.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So today, finally, we get back to Syria, because we promised last year that we would after the dramatic fall of the Assad regime and the amazing opening of the prisons.
Yeah, long term, there's been a full landscape of justice initiatives around Syria, but also all away from Syria itself. There's been accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity. Loads of things have been documented during the civil war, but accountability itself has been blocked on many levels, like the attempted referral to the International Criminal Court.
In recent weeks, we've seen institutions beating their path to Damascus. I noted the IIIM, that's the mechanism that's been doing some documentation out of Geneva on Syria. The International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, recently sanctioned by the US. I've also seen the OPCW, that's the chemical weapons body, who are looking at Syria. And as we record now in February, the newest kid on the block, the new independent institution on missing persons in Syria, has also been there. So we'll try and catch up with the new head of that institution and ask her what she's been up to.
We've also seen a lot of scattered European universal jurisdiction cases, some around terrorism, some focusing on ISIS. Most famously, one in Germany around torture and torture within the Syrian prison systems. And we'll put the link to the website because we've covered quite a few of them in previous pods.
So now what? Well, to help sketch out the new landscape, we have Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam and NIOD. NIOD's the Netherlands Institute for the Documentation of War Crimes during the Second World War and further on than that. And that's Uğur, Ümit, Üngör. Hi, Uğur.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Uğur is also the author of The Syrian Gulag, an oral history of victims and perpetrators, and that's about the estimated 300,000 people who've been detained or have died in prison since the Syrian uprising broke out. So we're speaking to you now in February 2025, but help us understand your specialist area. We need to know a little bit about the prison system, now the opening of those prisons and how many there were, who was in them. Take us back to the beginning and give us the basics if you can.
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Always very happy to speak about violence in Syria, whether that's in an earlier phase of the period under Hafez Assad, the first president in the Ba'athist era, or the most recent one who fled to Moscow on the 8th of December 2024. So my expertise is mostly in the study of mass violence, especially in violence against civilians. So in general, in our research field, there's a bit of a distinction between those who study war and those who study violence against civilians. And of course, there's overlap between these, especially in civil wars or in what they call total wars. But there are also discrete specialisms on people who focus on war studies, for example, on how soldiers fight and how many tanks in a division, things like that, more military history. And then there are people who study really the human toll of war, the impact that it has on civilians indirectly or directly. And I'm more interested in the second aspect of conflict and violence. And of course, genocide studies is a really huge field. It's burgeoned since the 1970s, really, as an offshoot of Holocaust research. We've seen the emergence of certain journals. There's a journal of genocide research. By now, there is also a journal called Victimology, and there's a journal called Journal of Perpetrator Research. So there's increasing specialization in this field, which is a good thing. And the number of cases, of course, is vast. So if you only look at the 20th century, about 60 to 80 million people have been victims of deliberate genocidal policies. But that's a staggering number.
Oh, the way that you're setting this all out for us at the moment, I'm starting to wonder, where does Syria fit into this? Are you kind of placing us in your bigger picture so that we can understand how significant Syria is?
Yeah, exactly. So we kind of thought that the 20th century was the century of genocide. But I think a lot of scholars who were writing in that period, they've spoken too soon, because look at the 21st century and how that's going. we're only a quarter in, and it's not going too well in terms of human rights and crimes against humanity and violence against civilians. And so when the Arab Spring began, as we all know, we all remember, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and a number of other Arab countries, there were demonstrations, and in all of these countries, the Arab Spring developed very differently. But probably the most violent cataclysm was in Syria. There, the Assad regime, which was, of course, a brutal dictatorship since 1970, since the father of the former president, Hafez Assad, established it. In Syria, really, the violence against these demonstrators in the streets was unprecedented, and even for Syrian history. So ordinary students or workers or housewives, anybody and everybody who was in the streets demonstrating was shot at, was arrested, beaten, tortured in the prison system. So that really got me interested. How is it possible that in the 21st century, we can watch on YouTube live a government exterminate its own population in this particular way? And so the levels of violence were so high that even a seasoned genocide scholar like myself could be shocked by it. We all know how the Syrian crisis escalated. Very quickly it became an entrenched civil war. But the violence against civilians by the Assad regime continued, even under the guise of the civil war. And in 2015, 2016, there were huge refugee flows to Europe, especially. There were already major refugee populations in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And as these refugees came to Europe, they also basically ended up in the city where I live, in Amsterdam. And I started meeting Syrians in like social events, or sometimes I would also, of course, look out for them. And the stories that they brought of arrest, of torture, of forced disappearances were really pretty shocking. So I thought there needs to be a more focused research on this. So at some point I met Jaber Becker, who's the co-author of my books, of our book Syrian Gulag. And he himself was a survivor of Saydnaya, that major prison that was opened in Damascus. And when he got out of prison, he committed really to researching this prison system. So when I met him, I basically asked him a simple question: why is it that we don't have an overview book yet of these prisons? And he said, there's none yet. And so we kind of sat down for coffee and we decided to write that book together. And so one thing led to another. And of course, there was the pandemic. But later we finished the book Syrian Gulag, which came out in Dutch, and then it came out in English. And now it's being translated into Arabic, French, and also German.
Since the Arab Spring, or one of the things that also your book highlights, is that this prison system seems to be really emblematic of this last Assad regime, where he put all those civilians in this vast prison system. But from what you were saying before, it seems like maybe this prison system was already there under his father and now was only expanded to include really more directed at large swathes of civilians. Can you say something about how this enormous system was created and how vast it is? I mean, you call your book Syrian Gulag, so I assume that means you draw a comparison also with the gulags in the Soviet Union. Is it the same kind of vast network? How many people are we talking about? How many sites?
Yeah, so the Syrian prison complex or system, it was difficult to convey a term for it that was more than just prisons, because we could have called the book Syrian prisons. But when you look at how this apparatus of violence, this bureaucracy, how it functions, it has a more systematic way of dealing with its victims, and it has a particular logic as well. So just saying prisons wasn't enough, so we call it the prison system. And it is a prison system that was not in scale, of course, but in its intensity and in the impact that it had on society, similar to the way that the Soviet Union dealt with its citizens, and also in the way that it, for example, surveilled its citizens. In Syria, the former dictator, Hafez Assad, he committed a coup d'etat in 1970, and he was determined to keep power for himself. He basically abolished the Syrian political spectrum, which means that anybody from the left or anybody from the right, anybody from the Islamist groups or anybody from the communist groups, anybody and everybody who could pose a political threat, he basically arrested the leadership and threw them in prison. They basically said, I'm the boss from now on, and I don't want any dissent. So that process gradually became entrenched in Syria. And Hafez Assad stayed in power for a long time, and by the time it was the late 70s or the early 80s, we were already dealing with a vast network of prisons run by the intelligence agencies that had an incredible grip on the society, like an octopus's tentacles, basically, tightly wrapped around the society, very, very tight control and surveillance. And the reason why this system was so stable is because Assad ran his country with 4 different intelligence agencies. And those were state security, the political security, the military intelligence, and the Air Force intelligence. 4 major organizations, each of which had a license to kill, license to arrest, and each of which ran its own prisons. In every city in Syria, there would be a big, ugly, concrete gray building with a couple of floors above ground, which would be the administration, and also a couple of floors underground, which is where the dungeons are, which is where the investigations happen, which is where the torture happens. And each of these agencies had a branch in every city, right? So in all of these provinces, there would be 3, 4 of these buildings. And if there's one thing you knew as a Syrian, that you wouldn't want to be caught there. And of course, why are there 4 different intelligence agencies? This is, of course, as we call it, coup-proofing the country. So if you lean too much on one intelligence agency, then maybe that the boss can become too powerful. So then you establish another one and you play them out against each other. And Assad was great at that.
The person that you wrote the book with, you say he was a former prisoner himself. Was he typical of the kind of person who got put into this system?
In many ways, yeah. So Jabir Bekr is somebody who is roughly my age, was born in the early 1980s, was an ordinary Syrian kid from a countryside of Damascus, made it through high school, went through university, and in university, somebody discussed with him a book which was illegal. It was a book that was prohibited. It was on politics in Syria and something related to Freemasonry in the history of Syria, something really innocuous. And of course, as soon as the regime found out it was one of the intelligence agents that was implanted, of course, in universities, the walls are listening. They pulled him in for questioning. And he's written about this beautifully, actually, in New Lines magazine. I recommend the article. They pulled him in for questioning, and then basically on trumped-up charges, they very quickly sent him to the Palestine branch, which is one of the most ruthless branches of the political security. And there he was beaten and tortured, and very quickly, without any due process, he was sent to Sednaya prison, where he spent over 2 years. So here's somebody, just an ordinary kid, going to university, having discussions with his fellow peers, which is what all of us have done in university, and he got arrested for that, for the simple fact that the regime thought he was doing something that might have posed a threat to the regime, or might have been critical of the regime. And so as soon as he got out, and he was studying mechanical engineering, that has nothing to do with history or social science or law, as soon as he got out, it was an enormous shock to him, of course. What just happened to me in my life? So he actually committed himself to writing a history of that very prison system that he came out of. Also, for the simple fact that in the prisons, you basically meet like a parallel Syrian society, right? So all the poets and intellectuals and academics and everybody's there. And we've seen recently in the past 2 months, the number of people released and also the profile of those people released from these prisons is really incredible. For example, there was a man released, he was a helicopter pilot and refused to bomb the city of Hama in 1982. And he was arrested for that. And he spent 40 years in prison, so most of his life, from his 20s until his mid-60s. There was somebody who won a horse riding competition over the president's son, which you should never do, of course, in Assad, Syria. So they threw him in prison for that, as a form of humiliation. He was in prison for decades. And the description of how this parallel society in prison operated was also really fascinating, because we're dealing with people who learn English in prison. Because you have plenty of time, you're not going anywhere, and there's a professor of English in your ward, for example. So that professor would set up classes, and they would learn, and you would actually understand what's going on in this country by spending that time in prison, because you would see all these political groups, and sometimes social groups, and sometimes different religious groups, who have really done nothing except who were perceived as a threat by the regime. And through their stories, actually, not only did Jabir lay a vast network of survivors that he could interview after he was out, but also he paints a really precise picture of this gulag, this prison system. And so we incorporated that into the book, and this is what the book is mostly based on interviews.
And so you have talked to Jabir and other people who came out. What we also see now coming out, and what was already hinted at and seen in satellite pictures before the opening up of Syria, is these mass graves that are apparently linked to these military and intelligence sites. Some are old, some are incredibly new. It seemed to have been activity just days before Assad fell. What is going to happen to these spaces? What is your idea of what is going on now? I know there's all these groups wanting to get to them. I see media reporting on it. I know from my own experience that we are also trying to report on it. Do you have any idea of what is happening to these spaces? Also the Sednaya prison, where you can see people picking through the cells, and we saw also the social media of people being released from the cells and children and women being taken out.
Yeah, so what happened on the 8th of December 2024 is really something that nobody really expected. There was a surprise offensive by the rebel group from the north, from Idlib, the HTS group, and they quickly overran Assad's positions. And then, interestingly, because Bashar al-Assad did not inform anybody that he was going to leave, or didn't inform guys, we lost, let's pack it in, on the 8th of December, when the rebels washed over the country and took Damascus, almost all of these intelligence branches and their archives were left completely intact. I mean, there were unfinished cups of coffee on the table. There were unsigned documents and directives on tables with a pen next to it. So as if everybody had just vanished into thin air. And the same thing with these mass graves. So the regime didn't have time, for example, to dig everybody up and burn them, for example, like the Nazis had done, for example, or to cut up the mass graves in a horrific way, dismember the bodies or the corpses, and then send one part of the corpses to one part of the country to make sure that the efforts for forensic identification would be difficult, like was done by the Bosnian Serbs, by Milosevic. So everything literally intact. And it was such an incredible shock, actually, to Syrians themselves, and also to those like human rights NGOs, for example, people working in transitional justice, lawyers, were so overwhelmed with this sudden departure of the regime and the sudden availability of all these archives that hold the truth about exactly what type of violence was committed against whom. And also the mass graves, so it's relatively clear who is in these mass graves, right? So right now, the Syrians are they're facing an unbelievable and unprecedented task and challenge of A, cataloging and archiving all of these files in the intelligence agencies and in the army. B, identifying who the victims are in all these mass graves. Or in general, finding all the mass graves, because there are many of them are still secret, and they're still finding them every once in a while, or even bumping into them. And C, the sites, so the prisons, for example, or even these intelligence branches. So what to do with them? Right, so there needs to be some form of memorialization or some form. I mean, these are sites of violence and sites of memory. So these three major tasks, this is exactly what people are facing right now. And it's going to be a daunting, really daunting task to get through this. For example, we're dealing with a country where they found a mass grave to the north of Damascus with most likely about 100,000 corpses, bodies in it. And that number corresponds almost one-to-one with the number of people who are forcibly disappeared and didn't show up anywhere else. So there was no death certificate. They were not released from prison. The intelligence agencies grabbed them, the prison system swallowed them, and they disappeared. There's no corpse, there's no information on their whereabouts, so most likely they either died under torture or they were executed, and the regime dumped their body into this mass grave. 100,000 bodies, and this is in a country where there's no DNA database. So what to do about this?
I know we're going to go sort of maybe in a little bit more detail on some of the issues. I just wanted to pick up with you to start with the documents and documentation. I had seen some reports that some documents had been burnt, but I've also seen from different organizations this idea that there are millions of pages. I'd had quoted to me several million by one organization and several 100,000 by another one. What's your understanding of the position on documentation and who's got it and who's going to be able to analyze and to provide something useful out of it?
The one advantage about the Assad regime, let me say one positive thing about the Assad regime, just as a joke, is that because they had so many intelligence agencies and so many branches, that even if one of the branches, the directors or the commanders of one of the branches decided last minute, guys, let's burn down the entire archive so that we get rid of the evidence of our own crimes, is that you can do that, but there's still dozens of other branches. And a lot of these orders, for example, and a lot of these debriefings too, they are copied and they're wired in circulars. So if something happens in one branch, the other branch also knows about it, not to mention the people upstairs. So for as far as I know, there's no one single authority that has a mandate on handling these intelligence archives. In most countries, that's the Ministry of Interior, and some it's the Ministry of Culture. Yeah, so the National Archives in The Hague, for example, here in the Netherlands, or those in Germany, for example, generally handled by the Ministry of Interior. This didn't exist in Syria yet. Also, Syria didn't really have a tradition of archiving so that historians can come and do research, or that academics can do research, or even for lawyers, for example, or for a tribunal, for example, to go and to find materials in these archives that could be incriminating, for example. There's no such tradition, so that needs to be set up. The other advantage about this, well, advantage, of course, in quotation marks, so let's say silver lining of that many Syrian refugees outside of Syria is that for a long time, for almost a decade, an entire generation of Syrians was educated at some of the top institutions around the world, some in neighboring countries, but many in Europe or North America or elsewhere. And these people now, of course, they have the skills and have the will to actually put their skills to use. For example, for a country like Syria that didn't really have the rule of law, where lawyers and courts were basically kangaroo courts, where the regime could overrule the constitution, the regime and intelligence agencies would trample their feet with the constitution and the courts, where no judge would ever think of, for example, convicting anybody from the Assad family for anything, even for running a red light. Now that can change.
I think it's good if I now ask you about, because you talked about the different branches and how that means that everybody always has a copy of something. And there's also a large amount of Syrians outside Syria. Did that also help the current situation? And what is the benefit of that?
I mean, it is, of course, only 2 months after the change of the regime, after the collapse of the regime and a new government, so it all remains to be seen. It's a unique historical moment right now, actually, for these people to go to Syria. I won't say return, but at least to go. And many of them that I've spoken to, they want to contribute, actually. For example, setting up a proper court system. For example, working on the rule of law. Or, for example, there are thousands of war criminals walking around in the country. To get these people on trial so there's some form of justice for the millions of victims that are in the country. So it is an important, really important historical moment, but we'll have to see how it develops.
Before we're going to go to what can be done and how these archives can be used, did I understand you correctly that it's super, super detailed and has the names and what has been done to people? And I always, when I hear that, I'm always surprised at essentially why anybody post-Nazi Germany would write everything down, because we've all seen this at the war crimes courts and the Nuremberg court. And you could see for the former Yugoslavia, they wrote orders down, but they weren't very good at keeping names of people they detained. But it seems to me that you are describing a system where it was all meticulously noted. So I wanted to check if I understood that properly.
Yeah, so maybe the third silver lining in the functioning of the Assad regime, it sounds weird to say it like that, but is the fact that the regime was meticulous and was assiduous in creating records of exactly the bureaucratic procedures of violence. So when did somebody get arrested, on what charge, who informed on that person, which officer was responsible for handling him or her, what exactly happened to him, how long was he kept in which branch, how was he transferred to which prison, when did he arrive in the prison, in what state did he arrive in the prison. So there are so many incredible details from the first glimpses that we got from these archives. Really, for historians, this is fascinating, but I also think for the people interested in justice is that if these records are, let's say, accurate, and one can simply find out by talking to the survivors or by interrogating the perpetrators themselves, and also by triangulating them. For example, you can look at the prison archives and you look at the archives of the intelligence branch and to see whether it corresponds. And if that's the case, then it's a daunting task first to create files on perpetrators, because their names will be all over the place. And I think the reason why the regime did this and documented its own crimes is, first of all, it wants to do its job well. Second, the various cogs in the wheel, they want to cover their backs, right? So if you arrest someone, you want to have a record of the fact that you arrested him, you handed him over, so you're no longer responsible for that person, right? So the branch is responsible or the prison is responsible. Because if you don't write that down, then later they can come back to you and say, well, hey, did you hand that person over to the prison, or did you take a bribe and let him go? Right? So there's also, there's checks and balances even inside a totalitarian regime, like the Assad regime. And that actually is an advantage now, let's say, in quotation marks, for people seeking justice or for historians trying to understand and recreate the history of the Assad regime.
Yeah, I want to definitely ask you about what the prospects are for justice domestically and where you think that's going to go. But I just wanted to kind of rewind several years to maybe remind listeners that one of the first indications that we had out of Syria of what was going on was from a person who was known at the time as Caesar, who took photographs of, I think, dead people inside one of the branches or several of the branches, and then provided those photos. And I watched an incredible interview with him on Al Jazeera last week where he kind of declared his identity. Was amongst the research community and so on, was it an open secret as to who he was, or was this a revelation? Maybe you could say a bit about how important that was.
The photos that were taken by a person codenamed Caesar, whose real name is Farid al-Madhan. And we no longer have to hide his name because there's no longer a threat from the Assad regime. I mean, a lot of individuals came out in the last 2 months, actually. People with code names or people who had to work under the surface, who had to work incognito, by saying, I am this person and I want to be out there. I want others to know that I'm doing this. Right? I mean, that sense of liberation for justice work is also really important, because there's one thing the Assad regime hated, and it was justice efforts, actually, more than anything else. I mean, the Caesar photos are exceptionally important. I mean, they are photographic evidence of a systematic mass torture, mass killing campaign, really, of the Assad regime, because many people were tortured until death followed. So rather than extracting information through torture, we're dealing here with people who were tortured until they died. So it's really execution through torture, which is a horrific thing to think about. And all these photos are really important for a number of reasons. First of all, he was a defected officer. So in a way, he was a whistleblower, and these people very often have the inside information exactly of how it functioned, right? And in many interviews that he did, also the testimony for Congress, he spoke very clearly about the bureaucracy, about exactly what the systematics was of how he worked, what the numbers meant. So in the Caesar photos, we often have a photo of a person who looks horrible, emaciated, passed away, of course, died, was murdered. And then there are 3 numbers, so he explains what the numbers are: the number of the branch, the number of the arrest, and then the number of processing in what was Hospital 601 in Damascus, which is where corpses were handled. All of this evidence is really useful because, well, if you don't have a corpus delicti, I think they call it, then obviously you don't have a case, right? So for that reason, for anybody who was involved, who contributed to the death of the victims in the Caesar photos, any and all of these intelligence branches, of course with Assad at the top because he controls all the branches, all of those people can be, for example, tried now. The advantage of having so many Syrians live outside the country is, of course, that there is a large population of Syrian justice professionals, lawyers, people who trained in prosecution, people for the first time ever Syrians trained in international criminal law, right? People who really understand the Rome Statute, who understand the ICC, who understand the special tribunals, and who've been to Bosnia or who've been to Serbia to talk with the war crimes offices and units. People who work, of course, with the European Universal Jurisdiction responsibles. So there's that really smart group of people who now, of course, stand in front of a bit of a dilemma, because all these years they thought the Assad regime wouldn't fall. So we have to invest in universal jurisdiction. Then all of a sudden the Assad regime falls, and so now what do? Right? Because there is a justice ministry in Syria now. And the man who runs it wasn't in the news a couple of weeks ago because of certain events that transpired in the beginning of the uprising. He was a Sharia judge in Jabhat al-Nusra. But there is a justice ministry, and there are many Syrians who were thirsty for justice. So what path, so where is a fork in the way now? Do we continue to work on universal jurisdiction, or do we invest actually in the Syrian justice ministry, which is underfunded, the building is leaking, nobody gets their salaries? So what direction exactly are we taking right now? And I think a lot of people are undecided about it as well. And I think also the Syrian government is undecided about it, because technically you could say, well, universal jurisdiction, thank you for your service. You can now hand over all those files and dossiers to Damascus now. We'll handle it from there because all the suspects are here. And so every day I'm in these WhatsApp group of Syrians, and every day I hear and I see suspects being arrested. And so it's great. So the suspect is in Damascus, but the case that's built on the suspect is somewhere in The Hague or is somewhere in Berlin. So how exactly do we deal with that then? I'm not that well informed about how that would work, for example, but because Syria hasn't ratified many international legal norms and standards. So whether they will accept, for example, those dossiers and files created by, for example, CIJA or, for example, by the ECCHR in Berlin, and I don't know, and they probably don't know that themselves either. But we have these dilemmas, definitely.
I'm going to stop you a little bit before you explain other problems, but you talked about the Jabhat al-Nusra group that the judge was a part of. That is, I think, designated in the Netherlands at least, and probably by the EU as a terrorist organization, and we've had people in the Netherlands being sentenced for their membership of this as a terrorist organization in war crimes trials. You also spoke about CIJA, which is the Commission for International Accountability and Justice, which does a lot of research and did a lot of getting evidence for war crimes in Syria. And we've talked to CIJA people. We will link to that pod as well. And you talked about the ECCHR, which is the kind of German justice initiative, which also does a lot of research and did really big work in these Koblenz trials of the Syria torture regime. And now you can go on with the other problem that we have.
An additional problem is that, the Syrian government currently has a classical dilemma of justice versus peace. So there are thousands of suspects out there. There is a popular demand on arresting every one of these people. And I would imagine that if you would do a referendum in Syria right now and you would ask them what to do with suspects, for example, of the Assad regime that are convicted, most people would probably vote in favor of the death penalty. So that's another problem or issue. But what we see now actually is the current government is now trying to balance the justice and peace problem. So recently, to give a very concrete example, the government found and arrested a man called Fadi Saqqar. And this is a man who used to run Assad's militias in the city of Damascus. You had the army, you had the intelligence, and then you had militias. And these militias, basically, they were mostly civilians that were armed, and they're like paramilitary groups whose task it was also to repress the uprising. and also to arrest anybody who they thought was suspect, and then bring them to the intelligence. So like auxiliary force. And these people, they committed an enormous spectrum of crimes against Syrian civilians. And every city in Syria had a head, and they just arrested the head for Damascus. But this was a major news in Syria, of course, because the man was responsible also for those who were responsible for example, the infamous Tadamun massacre in 2013, where Syrian intelligence and militias killed about 300 people and videotaped the entire massacre, right? So this is the man who was responsible for those people who were responsible for that massacre. So he's the commanding officer. And then lo and behold, within a week, there was news that broke out that Fadi Sakar reconciled with the government and that he had come to an agreement, quote unquote, that he would basically forswear any allegiance to the Assads, and they simply let him go. Immediately, there were demonstrations in the streets of Tadamun asking for his capture, because obviously a lot of people couldn't handle it. They were absolutely unhappy with the fact that the commanding officer who was responsible for the massacre of their own relatives and loved ones was out free again after a week with no punishment whatsoever. So these dilemmas will continue, and this is going to be a serious problem, I think, in Syria. Also for the simple fact that, for example, Assad's officers, the intelligence bosses, from the lowest rank to the highest rank, they also have a constituency. For example, there are certain villages in western Syria on the coast where half the village was in the army and the other half was in the intelligence. So you can raid that village and arrest every military-aged man, but then you will have a mutiny on your hand. There's a risk at further escalation of violence between communities. That's a real tightrope right now.
I think you outline the numbers of dilemmas really well there, and I think that we will be picking this up and we'll be asking the people we know who are now back in Syria themselves, what they think that they want to be getting on with. Maybe we can just ask you to finally just a bit of a wither question, which would be around, for example, the International Criminal Court and the sort of the way that Syria is going to relate with this bigger picture of accountability. As we mentioned before, Karim Khan, the prosecutor, went there, and I've certainly seen arguments. We can put a link in the website to people saying, Syria must join up with the ICC. I mean, do you really think that that is a likely prospect? I mean, considering all of these different sort of fears and trends and uncertainties?
I think there's so many uncertainties, and to quote Donald Rumsfeld, we don't know what we don't know. So, for example, the rebel group that toppled the Assad regime was called HTS. HTS is an outgrowth of what used to be called Jabhat al-Nusra, which was really the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria. And these were mostly like young, victimized, and therefore radicalized men who wanted to take revenge against the Assad regime, wanted to topple it with any violence possible, including with terroristic methods like IEDs and with suicide bombings, etc. Now, some of these guys, they are on terror lists in Europe, in the West, and also even in Turkey, in neighboring Turkey. So the dilemma there is, of course, that the ICC would have to work with some of these people who are themselves sanctioned. Now, the big irony now is that the ICC is sanctioned by the United States, and that the head of the Syrian head of state is also sanctioned by the United States. And so maybe that actually is a nice form of commiseration, so that some form of collaboration could work with it. But I think for the longer term, if you look at this society and this country, these people who have to live together, not just this generation, but also the future generations, I think what's really important and what would be a missed opportunity if that doesn't happen is actually investing in the Syrian Ministry of Justice. Because for over 50 years, there was a Ministry of Justice, but it was a kangaroo Ministry of Justice that didn't provide justice. The Syrian sense of justice for 2 or 3 generations has been completely warped by the Assad regime, in that if any injustice happened to you, you were arrested and tortured and then thrown out of prison. There was no recourse to any form of meaningful justice for you. So if the current government cannot provide that, or the current Ministry of Justice cannot provide it in the coming years or in the coming decades, then basically we perpetuate the problem that injustice keeps festering in the society. And that would be a real missed opportunity, I think.
We're going to wrap it up, even though we could probably do 5 podcasts on 3 different things you said here. We always, at the end of our podcast, ask our asymmetrical haircuts questions. I'm going to be mean and skip the what didn't we ask and you want to say, because I think that's going to add another 10 minutes to the podcast. And I'm going to ask you, because we are all legal wonks, at least on the podcast, and a lot of our listeners are, do you have a favorite trial or a case that you like to talk about or that you teach, or one that inspired you to do the work you do, or one that's just really, really amusing to talk about?
My favorite trial would be really the trial of Saddam Hussein. in the High Court of Iraq in Baghdad for the simple fact that Saddam just refused to accept the legitimacy of the court, accept the legitimacy of the new Iraqi government, and he kept saying, do you know who you're talking to? I'm the president of Iraq. So that whole trial wasn't interesting for the fact that it would provide justice for Saddam's crimes, but for the fact that it was like a theater of delusion, of trying to understand how Saddam Hussein still, years after he was arrested, would still believe that he is actually the president of Iraq. So it's like a photo negative of a trial in that what it intended to do, it didn't achieve, but it achieved to provide a picture of something that we otherwise wouldn't have seen.
And do you have any books or films or podcasts you'd like to recommend? They can be in the field or they can be what you use to get away from it. And of course, we'll do a link to your work on the website.
There is a thriller drama movie called Ghost Trail, and it's about a secret group of Syrians who were tracking Syrian regime fugitives, so Assad regime criminals who flee to Europe and to France and Germany and elsewhere. And it's about a young man who joins that group in trying to pursue his own former torturer. And I think that's a really powerful film.
Thank you so much for coming on and squeezing us in to your busy work and home life. Our listeners can't see it, but we're looking at Üngör's newly moved into apartment. So he has a lot to do. As we all know, when you move apartments, there's a lot of unpacking. I still have boxes from moving here 10 years ago, so no shame in that. Thank you so much for just this very wide explanation. And there's so much going on with Syria. And even though we don't really get any further on what is going to happen now, I think we did touch on all the kind of different aspects in play. And this is going to be one of those things we're just going to have to keep an eye on and see how it develops.
Thank you for having me, and good luck with the podcast.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast. Created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.